It was a bright, sunny morning in suburban California, the kind of day that makes you think nothing could possibly go wrong. Birds were chirping, lawns were perfectly manicured, and the HOA president, Karen, was probably already out patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard of doom. Meanwhile, I was in my kitchen, sipping coffee and mentally preparing for another day as a prosecutor. Life was good, or so I thought. Then it happened. Dad! My 10-year-old son Ethan's voice shattered the calm like a brick through a window. I rushed to the living room to find him clutching his throat, his face pale. My heart dropped. Ethan has a severe peanut allergy, and his EpiPen is our lifeline. "Where's your medication?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my brain screamed, "Don't panic. Don't panic." "I don't know. It was on the porch," Ethan gasped. "The porch? Oh no. I had left it there last night after unloading groceries." My stomach sank as I remembered the HOA's ridiculous rule. No personal items are to be left in communal areas overnight. A rule enforced with the zeal of a medieval inquisition by Karen herself. I bolted to the porch. Empty. Not even a trace of the small cooler bag that held Ethan's life-saving medication. My eyes darted to the trash bins lined up neatly at the curb. Could it be? No, surely not even Karen would stoop that low. Spoiler alert. She would. I sprinted to the bins and yanked open the lid of our trash can. Nothing but coffee grounds and yesterday's leftovers stared back at me. Desperate, I moved to the next bin, our neighbors, and then another. Finally, in the third bin, there it was, Ethan's cooler bag, wedged between a pizza box and what appeared to be an old garden hose. I pulled it out like Indiana Jones retrieving a priceless artifact. But when I unzipped it, my worst fears were confirmed. The EpiPen was gone. Now, let me pause here for a moment to say this. I've dealt with some truly despicable people in my career as a prosecutor. Embezzlers, fraudsters, even a guy who tried to smuggle exotic reptiles in his pants. But nothing prepared me for the sheer pettiness of Karen from the HOA. I stormed over to her house, cooler bag in hand. Karen answered the door with her trademark smug smile and an air of self-importance that could suffocate a room. "Karen?" I began, trying to keep my voice calm despite the volcanic rage bubbling just beneath the surface. "Did you throw away my son's medication?" Her smile didn't falter for a second. "Oh, Jack. Good morning. Yes, I noticed that cooler bag on your porch last night. You know the rules. No personal items left outside overnight." "That wasn't trash," I said through gritted teeth. "That was my son's EpiPen." Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked pleased with herself. "Well," she said with a shrug that could win an Olympic gold medal for passive aggressiveness. "How was I supposed to know? It looked like garbage. Garbage. Garbage." It took every ounce of self-control not to lose it right then and there. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Karen, that medication is literally life-saving. You could have killed my son." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. Rules are rules." Yes, rules are rules. The HOA mantra that justifies everything from fining people for having slightly mismatched curtains to banning inflatable holiday decorations because they're tacky. But this wasn't about aesthetics or property values. This was about my son's life. I turned on my heel and walked away before I said something that might jeopardize my career or land me in jail. Back at home, Ethan was okay for now. We always keep a backup EpiPen in the house for emergencies. But as I sat there fuming over Karen's complete lack of humanity, an idea began to form in my mind. A plan so perfect it almost made me smile despite my anger. You see, Karen didn't know one very important thing about me. I'm not just any dad. I'm a prosecutor. And if there's one thing prosecutors are good at, it's finding loopholes and using them to their advantage. I spent the rest of the day researching California HOA laws and regulations, specifically those outlined in something called the Davis-Sterling Act. For those unfamiliar, read Lucky. This is basically the Bible for HOAs in California. It governs everything from how they collect dues to how they enforce rules, and more importantly, what they're not allowed to do. Turns out, tossing someone's personal property without proper notice isn't just petty. It's illegal under California Civil Code Section 1980. Something or other Don't quote me. I'm paraphrasing here. And when that property happens to be life-saving medication. Well, let's just say Karen had opened herself and the HOA to some serious legal liability. Armed with this knowledge and fueled by righteous indignation and maybe a little pettiness of my own, I drafted an official complaint against Karen and the HOA board for negligence and endangerment. But that wasn't all. I also filed for an emergency injunction requiring them to revise their rules about personal items to include exceptions for medical equipment. By evening, I had emailed copies of everything, complete with citations from both state law and HOA bylaws, to every member of the board, and CC'd Karen for good measure. The next morning, let's just say Karen wasn't smiling anymore when she saw me walking Ethan to school. His new EpiPen safely tucked into his backpack where no clipboard-wielding tyrant could get her hands on it. Justice may not always come swiftly, but when it does, oh boy, it's sweet enough to make even an HOA meeting bearable. And that's how I turned one woman's petty power trip into a lesson she, and everyone else in our neighborhood, won't soon forget. Alright, let's talk about Karen. You know Karen, the queen of the clipboard, the self-appointed sheriff of suburban order, the tyrant who believes every blade of grass should bow to her HOA bylaws. If you've ever lived in an HOA neighborhood, you've probably encountered someone like her. And if you haven't, count your blessings because Karen is the kind of person who could make Gandhi lose his temper. Now, let me set the stage for you. After the whole EpiPen debacle, I decided it was time to dig into the HOA's history, and by history, I mean Karen's reign of terror. Turns out, she wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was the rule. Karen had been president of our HOA for 5 years, and in that time, she turned our neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. She fined people for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes too long, banned holiday decorations that weren't tasteful, and once sent a cease and desist letter to a neighbor whose dog barked during quiet hours. The dog was a puppy. But here's the kicker. Karen didn't even follow her own rules. Oh no, she was above them. Her lawn? A jungle of weeds. Her mailbox? Crooked and rusted. And her driveway? Always cluttered with random junk that would have earned anyone else a fine faster than you can say, HOA violation. It was like living under a dictator who couldn't be bothered to clean up her own palace. So naturally, I started asking around. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who had beef with Karen. There was Greg from Lot 23, who got fined $200 because his garden gnome was too whimsical, and Susan from Lot 12, who received a warning letter because her porch light was too bright. Even Bob from Lot 7, Karen's supposed ally, admitted that she once threatened to report him for parking his truck too close to the curb. The more stories I heard, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was weaponizing them. She used fines and warnings like arrows in her quiver, targeting anyone who dared to cross her, or worse, question her authority. And yet somehow, she kept getting reelected as HOA president year after year. Why? Because Karen had mastered the art of HOA politics. She knew how to schmooze just enough people to stay in power while alienating everyone else. She hosted wine and cheese nights for the board members, who were mostly her friends, sent out newsletters praising herself for upholding community standards, and even organized an annual barbecue where she handed out certificates of compliance to residents who followed the rules without complaint. It was nauseating. But here's where things get interesting. Karen didn't realize who she was messing with when she threw away Ethan's medication. I'm not just some random dad. I'm a prosecutor. And if there's one thing prosecutors are good at, it's finding dirt on people who think they're untouchable. So I started digging into Karen's past. Not just her HOA record, but everything else I could find. And let me tell you, it didn't take long for the skeletons to come tumbling out of her closet. First off, Karen had been signing contracts on behalf of the HOA without board approval. A big no-no under California law. She'd hired landscapers, painters, and even a security company without so much as a vote from the board members. When I confronted one of them, a guy named Bill who ran a local landscaping business, he admitted that Karen had paid him in cash and told him not to worry about receipts. Is that normal? I asked. Bill shrugged. Not really, but she said it was an emergency. An emergency to trim hedges? Then there were the fines. Oh, the fines. Turns out, Karen had been pocketing some of them instead of depositing them into the HOA account. How did I find this out? Simple. I requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, which they're legally required to provide, and noticed some discrepancies. For example, there were fines listed in meeting minutes that didn't appear anywhere in the financial records. When I brought this up at the next HOA meeting, a beige torture chamber decorated with fake plants and motivational posters like "Teamwork makes the dream work," Karen tried to play it off like it was no big deal. "Oh," she said with a smile so fake it could have been sold at Walmart. "Those were just small fines we decided not to enforce." "Small?" Greg from Lot 23 piped up. "You fined me $200 for my garden gnome." Karen blinked but didn't respond. And then there was the cherry on top. Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including repairs on her own house. This wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. When I confronted her about it during another meeting, because yes, I started attending every meeting, she claimed it was an oversight. "An oversight?" I said incredulously. "You spent $1,500 on roof repairs." "Well," she said with a nervous laugh, "the HOA needed a good example." "A good example?" Greg shouted from across the room. "Your roof doesn't even match your siding." At this point, half the room was laughing while the other half looked ready to riot. Karen tried to regain control by banging her sparkly pink gavel, a prop she'd bought online, but it was too late. The tide had turned against her. And that's when I knew. It wasn't enough to expose Karen's corruption. I had to take her down completely. So I started gathering signatures for a petition to remove her as HOA president. A process outlined in our bylaws but rarely used because most people don't have the time or energy to fight back against petty dictators like Karen. But this time, people were ready. Within 2 weeks, I had signatures from over half the neighborhood, including Bob from Lot 7, who finally grew a spine, and Susan from Lot 12, who wanted revenge for her porch light. Even Greg from Lot 23 signed on despite his initial skepticism. When I presented the petition at yet another meeting, this time armed with notarized documents and legal citations, Karen looked like she'd seen a ghost. "You can't do this," she shouted. "Oh," I said with a grin that could rival hers in smugness. "But we can." And just like that, Queen Karen's reign began crumbling before our eyes. So, there I was, standing in the middle of the HOA meeting room, holding a petition with enough signatures to dethrone Karen from her self-proclaimed kingdom. The air was thick with tension, and Karen's face was a shade of red that could only be described as fire hydrant meets rage. She looked like she was about to burst into a monologue about how she was the glue holding the neighborhood together. But before she could say a word, Greg from Lot 23 piped up. "Does this mean I can finally put my garden gnome back?" he asked, holding up a picture of said gnome like it was evidence in a murder trial. Karen shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "This is not about your gnome, Greg," she snapped. "No, Karen," I said, stepping forward with my best courtroom voice, the one that makes juries lean in and defendants sweat. "This is about accountability. This is about fairness. And most importantly, this is about your blatant disregard for the rules you claim to uphold." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Even Bob from Lot 7, Karen's former lapdog, nodded along. Karen tried to regain control by banging her sparkly pink gavel again, but it was clear her reign was over. The HOA board voted unanimously to hold an emergency election for a new president, and Karen stormed out of the room muttering something about ungrateful peasants. But here's the thing, removing Karen wasn't enough for me. Oh no, I wanted justice. Not just for Ethan's medication, but for every ridiculous fine, every passive-aggressive letter, and every ounce of misery she'd inflicted on our neighborhood. So I decided to take things up a notch. The next morning, I filed an official complaint against Karen with the California Department of Consumer Affairs, the agency that oversees HOAs in the state. My complaint included everything: her unauthorized contracts, her misuse of HOA funds, and her reckless decision to throw away life-saving medication without proper notice. I even attached copies of the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered and cited specific sections of the Davis-Sterling Act to back up my claims. Now, filing a complaint with a government agency might sound boring or bureaucratic, but let me tell you, it's like dropping a grenade into someone's carefully constructed house of cards. Within days, Karen received a notice from the department demanding an explanation for her actions and threatening legal consequences if she didn't comply. And oh boy, did she comply. Karen suddenly became very cooperative, probably because she realized she was in way over her head. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood apologizing for any misunderstandings and promising to reimburse anyone who had been unfairly fined during her tenure. She even offered to step down from the HOA board entirely, a move that shocked everyone because Karen stepping down voluntarily was like pigs sprouting wings and flying. But here's where things get really juicy. As part of her apology tour, Karen invited me over to her house for coffee, a gesture that felt less like hospitality and more like damage control. Naturally, I accepted because who wouldn't want to see the inside of Karen's lair? Her house was exactly what you'd expect. Pristine furniture that looked like it had never been sat on, framed motivational quotes about leadership hanging on every wall, and shelves lined with HOA manuals organized by color. It was like walking into the headquarters of suburban tyranny. Karen greeted me with an awkward smile and handed me a cup of coffee so strong it could have powered a small car. "Jack," she began in a tone that was equal parts desperate and rehearsed. "I just want to say how sorry I am for everything that happened with Ethan's medication." I nodded politely but didn't say anything because silence makes people squirm, and oh boy did Karen squirm. "I hope we can move past this," she continued, clutching her coffee mug like it was a lifeline. "You know how much I care about this community. Do you?" I asked casually. Karen blinked. "Of course. Why would you even ask that?" "Well," I said, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like regret and bad decisions. "Throwing away life-saving medication doesn't exactly scream community care, does it?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when she realized there wasn't much she could say that wouldn't make things worse. The rest of our conversation was filled with awkward small talk about property values and landscaping tips. Topics Karen clearly thought would distract me from her mountain of wrongdoing. But here's the thing. I wasn't there to forgive or forget. I was there to savor my victory. By the time I left Karen's house, it was clear she'd learned an important lesson. Never mess with someone who knows how to read legal codes, and definitely don't mess with their kids' medication. Over the next few weeks, things started changing in our neighborhood. For the better. The HOA board revised its rules to include exceptions for medical equipment and personal items deemed necessary. Fines became less arbitrary, good news for Greg's garden gnome, and communication between residents and the board improved dramatically. It was like living in a whole new neighborhood, a neighborhood free from Karen's iron grip. As for Karen, she disappeared from public view faster than you can say, HOA scandal. Rumor has it she moved out of state to start fresh in another HOA community. A thought that makes me shudder because somewhere out there is another group of unsuspecting homeowners about to experience suburban tyranny firsthand. But as far as I'm concerned, justice was served, and served hot with a side of petty revenge. And Ethan? He's doing great, no thanks to Karen. His new EpiPen is safely stored in our kitchen cabinet where no clipboard-wielding tyrant can get her hands on it. And every time we walk past Greg's house and see his whimsical garden gnome proudly displayed on his lawn, we smile because sometimes victory looks like a tiny ceramic statue flipping off authority. So yeah, Karen messed with the wrong dad. And now, she'll think twice before tossing anything into the trash ever again. You'd think the story ends there, right? Karen dethroned, the neighborhood liberated, Ethan's medication safe from the clutches of suburban tyranny. But no, Karen wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, like a bad rash. She had one last flare-up before disappearing into the abyss of HOA history. It started with a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual letter, delivered to my mailbox in an envelope that smelled faintly of desperation and cheap perfume. The return address? Karen's. Of course. I opened it cautiously, half expecting glitter to explode in my face or a subpoena to fall out. Instead, it was a handwritten note on stationery that read, "From the desk of Karen." Because of course she has custom stationery. Dear Jack, it began, in loopy cursive that looked like it had been practiced for hours. I hope this letter finds you well. Spoiler alert, it didn't. I've been reflecting on recent events, she continued, and I feel that there are unresolved matters between us that deserve further discussion. Unresolved matters? What was this, a breakup letter? I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to meet with you again, to clear the air, and discuss how we can move forward in a way that benefits the entire community. Yes, the entire community. Karen's favorite phrase when she wanted to disguise her personal vendettas as noble causes. She signed off with warm regards and her full name, Karen Elizabeth Whitaker, as if I needed reminding of who she was. I stared at the letter for a good 5 minutes, debating whether to respond or just frame it as a trophy of my victory. Ultimately, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to meet her. Partly because I wanted to see what kind of nonsense she'd come up with this time, and partly because I knew it would make for a great story. We agreed to meet at a local coffee shop, a neutral territory where Karen couldn't wield her HOA powers or summon her clipboard army. She arrived 10 minutes early, classic Karen, and was already seated at a corner table when I walked in. She waved at me like we were old friends, which was both unsettling and hilarious given our history. Jack, she said brightly as I approached. Thank you so much for coming. I nodded politely and sat down across from her, mentally preparing myself for whatever circus act she was about to perform. So, she began, stirring her coffee with the intensity of someone trying to dissolve their regrets in caffeine. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Which part? I asked innocently. The part where you threw away my son's medication or the part where you misused HOA funds? Karen flinched but quickly recovered with a tight smile. All of it, she said vaguely. And I realize now that perhaps I may have been too rigid in my approach. Too rigid? That was like calling Mount Everest a bit tall. I want you to know, she continued, leaning forward as if we were sharing some deep secret, that everything I did was for the good of the community. I raised an eyebrow. Throwing away life-saving medication was for the good of the community? Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second before launching into what can only be described as an Olympic-level mental gymnastics routine. Well, she said slowly, choosing her words like they were landmines, I thought it was trash, and trash left out overnight can attract pests. Pests? I repeated incredulously. Yes, she said firmly. Rats, raccoons. You know how important it is to maintain property values. Yes, property values, the holy grail of HOA logic. Never mind human lives. As long as your Zillow estimate stays high, all sins are forgiven. And what about the fines? I asked, deciding to poke another hole in her flimsy defense. Were those for property values too? Karen sighed dramatically, like a martyr sacrificing herself for the greater good. Jack, she said solemnly, sometimes tough decisions have to be made. Tough decisions? I echoed. You fined Greg $200 for having a garden gnome. Karen's face twitched slightly at the mention of Greg's name, a reminder that her gnome vendetta had become neighborhood legend. Well, she said after a pause, it wasn't just any garden gnome. It was whimsical. Whimsical? Was that even a crime? And let's not forget Susan's porch light, I added, enjoying how uncomfortable Karen was becoming. What was wrong with that again? It was too bright, Karen snapped before catching herself and softening her tone. It disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Aesthetic harmony? This woman could write poetry about pettiness. The conversation went on like this for nearly an hour, Karen attempting to justify every ridiculous decision she'd ever made while I countered with facts and logic that left her squirming in her seat. By the end of it, she looked like someone who'd just run a marathon uphill in heels. Jack, she said finally, placing her hands flat on the table as if bracing herself for impact. I know we've had our differences, but I truly believe we can find common ground. Common ground? The only common ground we shared was living in the same zip code. I'm willing to make amends, she continued earnestly. Whatever it takes. Now here's where things get interesting. Karen wasn't just apologizing. She was offering me something big. "I'd like to nominate you for HOA president," she said suddenly. I blinked at her in disbelief. Was this real life? Karen, the woman who had ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist, was handing me the keys to her kingdom? "Why?" I asked suspiciously. "Because you care about this community," she said with what might have been genuine sincerity, or just really good acting. "And because, well, people seem to like you." People liked me? That was news. "And what about you?" I asked pointedly. "What happens to you?" Karen hesitated before answering carefully. "I'll step down from the board entirely." Step down? This wasn't just an apology, it was an abdication. For a moment, I considered taking her offer. Not because I wanted power, but because part of me wanted to see what it felt like sitting on Karen's throne. But then reality hit me. Being HOA president meant dealing with people like Karen every day, and honestly, no amount of revenge was worth that level of stress. So instead of accepting her offer outright, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. A smile that said checkmate. "Thanks for the offer," I said casually, finishing my coffee and standing up to leave. "But I think Greg would make a great president." Karen's face froze in shock as I walked away, and let me tell you, seeing her speechless was worth every second of this entire ordeal. So, after I dropped the bombshell that Greg, yes, whimsical garden gnome Greg, would make a better HOA president than me, I walked out of that coffee shop feeling like I just won the Super Bowl of petty revenge. Karen's face? Priceless. She looked like someone had told her that Crocs were now mandatory footwear. But little did I know, the drama wasn't over yet. Oh no, my friends. Karen had one last act in her suburban soap opera. Now, let me tell you about Greg. Greg is the kind of guy who wears Hawaiian shirts to HOA meetings and thinks mowing his lawn once a month is good enough. He's not exactly leadership material, but he's got heart, and more importantly, he's got a vendetta against Karen that rivals mine. So when I casually suggested he run for HOA president, he took the idea and ran with it like a kid chasing an ice cream truck. Within days, Greg was campaigning like it was a presidential election. He printed flyers with slogans like, "Vote for Greg," "Less rules, more fun," and handed them out door to door. He hosted a barbecue in his backyard where he promised free hot dogs and no fines for garden gnomes. He even made a campaign video featuring his dog wearing sunglasses and sitting next to his infamous gnome. It was ridiculous and absolutely perfect. Meanwhile, Karen was spiraling. She'd gone from offering me the presidency to trying to sabotage Greg's campaign. She started spreading rumors about him. Things like, Greg doesn't recycle, and Greg uses his sprinklers during drought restrictions. It was peak Karen behavior. Petty, dramatic, and completely transparent. But here's the thing, no one cared. The neighborhood was so fed up with Karen's nonsense that Greg could have promised to replace all the streetlights with disco balls and people still would have voted for him. By the time election day rolled around, it wasn't even close. Greg won by a landslide. The first HOA meeting under Greg's leadership was chaotic, to say the least. Picture this. Greg sitting at the head of the table in a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, holding a beer instead of a gavel. His opening statement? "All right, folks, first order of business. Let's chill out." Karen sat in the corner, arms crossed so tight, she looked like she was trying to fold herself into another dimension. She didn't say a word during the meeting. Not even when Greg officially repealed the fine on garden gnomes and declared them symbols of freedom. But here's where things get interesting. As much as I enjoyed watching Karen squirm under Greg's laid-back regime, I couldn't help but notice something strange. She wasn't just quiet. She was plotting something. You know that look people get when they're about to do something shady? That was Karen at every meeting. And then it happened. One morning, I woke up to find an anonymous letter in my mailbox. Typed this time, because apparently Karen had upgraded her passive-aggressive tactics. The letter accused Greg of violating HOA bylaws by hosting his barbecue without proper permits and threatened legal action if he didn't step down as president. Now, let's pause for a second here. Hosting a barbecue without permits? That's not just petty, that's Olympic-level pettiness. And we all knew who was behind it. Greg, bless his heart, tried to laugh it off. "What are they gonna do?" he joked at the next meeting. "Fine me for serving hot dogs?" But Karen wasn't joking. She filed an official complaint with the HOA board, a board that now consisted mostly of Greg's friends but still had to follow protocol because rules are rules, even ridiculous ones. The complaint triggered an investigation into Greg's presidency, a process that involved paperwork so tedious it could make you question your will to live. As much as I hated seeing Karen try to weasel her way back into power, I couldn't deny one thing. She knew how to play dirty. And while Greg might have been great at hosting barbecues and rallying neighbors against tyranny, he wasn't exactly equipped to handle legal battles, which is where I came in. You see, being a prosecutor isn't just about arguing in court. It's about knowing how to navigate bureaucracy and use it to your advantage. And if Karen wanted to play hardball, well, she'd picked the wrong opponent. I offered to help Greg draft his defense, a move that surprised him because apparently he thought my legal expertise only extended to yelling at Karen during meetings. But once we got started, it became clear that we had more than enough ammunition to shut down her complaint. First off, we discovered that Karen herself had hosted multiple events during her presidency without permits, including her infamous wine and cheese nights where she handed out certificates of compliance like they were participation trophies. If hosting barbecues without permits was grounds for removal, then Karen should have been removed years ago. Second, we found out that Karen had violated several other bylaws during her tenure, including one about using HOA funds for personal expenses. Remember those roof repairs? By the time we finished compiling evidence against her, it looked less like a defense for Greg and more like an indictment of Karen. When we presented our findings at the next board meeting, which was packed because apparently everyone loves drama, Karen tried to play innocent. "These accusations are baseless," she said with her trademark fake smile. "Really?" I countered, pulling out copies of receipts showing her unauthorized expenses. "Because this looks pretty solid to me." The room erupted into murmurs as people leaned forward to get a better look at the evidence. Even Bob from Lot 7, who'd been suspiciously quiet since Greg took over, looked impressed. Karen tried to argue her way out of it, but every point she made was met with more evidence against her. By the end of the meeting, she looked like someone who'd just lost a game of Monopoly after mortgaging all their properties. The board voted unanimously to dismiss her complaint against Greg, and then voted again to ban anonymous complaints altogether, a move clearly aimed at Karen. It was another victory for justice, and another blow to Karen's ego. As for Greg, he celebrated by hosting another barbecue, this time with permits because apparently he learned something from all this chaos. And yes, there were garden gnomes everywhere. Karen? She stopped attending meetings altogether, not because she'd given up, but because she knew she couldn't win anymore. Her reign of terror was officially over, and honestly, it felt pretty good knowing I played a part in taking her down. So yeah, justice prevailed once again in our little suburban battlefield. And while life isn't perfect, at least we can sleep soundly knowing there's one less clipboard-wielding tyrant in our midst. After Karen's anonymous complaint against Greg crashed and burned like a poorly planned fireworks display, I thought we'd finally reached the end of her reign of terror. The neighborhood was buzzing with relief. Greg was thriving as our new HOA president. Well, thriving in Greg terms meant fewer fines and more backyard barbecues. And Karen had gone radio silent. It was almost too good to be true. And as it turns out, it was. You see, Karen wasn't the kind of person who could just fade gracefully into obscurity. No, Karen was the type who'd go down swinging, even if she had to swing at thin air. So while the rest of us were enjoying our newfound freedom from her clipboard dictatorship, Karen was busy plotting her comeback. Started subtly, almost laughably so. One morning, I noticed a flyer taped to my mailbox. It read, "Concerned Citizens for Neighborhood Excellence. Join us." Below that was a list of vague promises like better community standards and fair enforcement of rules. And at the bottom, a contact email that suspiciously included the name Karen. I chuckled to myself and tossed the flyer in the recycling bin. Surely no one would take this seriously, right? I mean, we just ousted her from power. Why would anyone willingly sign up for more Karen? But then I started seeing those flyers everywhere, on lampposts, on bulletin boards at the local grocery store, even tucked under windshield wipers in the neighborhood parking lot. Karen wasn't just trying to stage a comeback. She was launching a full-blown PR campaign. At first, people ignored it, After all, we'd had enough of Karen's community excellence to last a lifetime. But then she started hosting meetings, actual meetings, in her living room. And let me tell you, Karen's living room is exactly what you'd expect. Pristine white furniture that looks like it's never been touched, decorative pillows with phrases like "live, laugh, love," and an entire wall dedicated to framed certificates, most of which she probably awarded herself. Greg attended one of these meetings out of curiosity, and because he thought there might be free snacks. When he came back, he looked both amused and horrified. "She's calling it a grassroots movement," he said, shaking his head. "Grassroots? Like she's running for Congress or something. What does she want?" I asked. "To restore order," Greg replied, making air quotes with his fingers. "She says the neighborhood is descending into chaos under my leadership." Chaos? Sure. Greg's leadership style was more laid-back dad than strict principle. But chaos? That was a stretch. Unless you count Susan's porch light, which she'd upgraded to a multicolored LED that now blinked like a disco ball. There wasn't much chaos to speak of. Still, Karen wasn't backing down. Her flyers kept multiplying like weeds in an unkempt lawn. Her meetings grew more frequent and reportedly more dramatic. And soon she started gathering signatures for something called the Community Restoration Petition. Now let me explain what this petition was about because it's both hilarious and infuriating. Essentially, Karen wanted to dissolve the current HOA board, including Greg, and replace it with her own hand-picked team of rule enforcers. She claimed this would bring stability back to the neighborhood, a neighborhood that was perfectly stable except for her antics. At first, no one took the petition seriously. Greg laughed it off. Susan joked about signing it just to see what would happen. Even Bob from Lot 7 rolled his eyes when Karen tried to recruit him as a supporter. But then something unexpected happened. Karen started gaining traction. It wasn't much, just a handful of signatures from people who either didn't know better or secretly missed her authoritarian style, but it was enough to make Greg nervous. "Jack," he said one evening over beers in his backyard, because where else would Greg discuss politics? "I think she might actually pull this off." I raised an eyebrow. "Karen? Pull this off?" She couldn't even pull off matching curtains. "I'm serious," Greg insisted. "She's got Bob on board now, and you know how Bob is." Yes, Bob, the eternal fence-sitter who could be swayed by anything from free wine to mildly convincing arguments about property values. "All right," I said with a sigh. "Let's shut this down before it gets out of hand." And so began Operation Stop Karen, a campaign that was equal parts strategy and satire because honestly, if we were going to fight Karen's nonsense, we might as well have fun doing it. First, we countered her flyers with our own. "Keep calm and let Greg grill. Say no to chaos." Below that was a picture of Greg flipping burgers next to his dog wearing sunglasses again because why not? Next, we hosted our own meetings. Outdoors in Greg's backyard because nothing says rebellion like beer and barbecue, and invited everyone in the neighborhood except Karen and Bob because we weren't sure whose side he was on. Finally, we launched what can only be described as a smear campaign against Karen, not by spreading rumors but by highlighting her greatest hits. The garden gnome fine, the porch light debacle, the unauthorized roof repairs, you get the idea. The result? Absolute chaos, but not the kind Karen had warned about. This was good chaos. The kind where neighbors bonded over shared grievances and laughed at absurdities instead of fighting over lawn heights. By the time Karen tried to present her petition at an HOA meeting, which she wasn't even supposed to attend, she looked defeated before she even started speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began in her best attempt at sounding professional, "I believe this neighborhood deserves better." "Better than what?" Susan interrupted from the back row. Karen ignored her and continued, "Under current leadership." "You mean Greg?" Susan interrupted again. "Yes," Karen snapped before regaining composure. "Under current leadership, we've seen standards decline." "Standards like garden gnomes?" Greg chimed in with a grin. The room erupted into laughter while Karen stood there fuming silently, a queen without her crown. In the end, her petition failed miserably, not because people didn't care about community standards, but because they cared more about keeping their sanity intact. And honestly, that felt like victory enough for me. So yeah, Karen tried one last time to reclaim her throne but ended up digging herself deeper into irrelevance instead. And while life isn't perfect, Susan's disco light is still blinding. At least we can all agree on one thing. Suburban drama is way more entertaining when you're not living under tyranny. Alright folks, here we are, the grand finale of the saga that is Karen versus the neighborhood. After her petition flopped harder than a bad reality TV pilot, you'd think Karen would finally get the hint and retire from public life. Maybe take up knitting or start a blog about suburban landscaping. But no, Karen wasn't just defeated, she was humiliated. And if there's one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was losing. Now, I don't know if she spent her days pacing around her pristine living room or plotting revenge while sipping overpriced herbal tea. But one thing was clear. Karen wasn't done with us yet. Her next move? A lawsuit. That's right. A full-blown legal battle against the HOA. The lawsuit was so absurd that Greg thought it was a prank when he first got served. The official complaint accused the HOA board of negligence, mismanagement, and my personal favorite, failure to uphold community standards. It read like Karen had taken every passive-aggressive email she'd ever written and turned it into legal jargon. Greg called me immediately. "Jack, what do we do?" he asked, sounding more panicked than I'd ever heard him. First, I said, "We laugh." And laugh we did, for a solid 5 minutes. "Okay," Greg said once we'd calmed down. "But seriously, how do we handle this?" "Don't worry," I assured him. "Karen's case is weaker than her arguments at HOA meetings." Now, here's the thing about lawsuits. They're expensive, time-consuming, and generally a pain in the neck. But they're also my bread and butter. As a prosecutor, I've dealt with everything from frivolous claims to high-stakes litigation. So Karen's amateur attempt at legal warfare was like watching a toddler try to play chess. I offered to represent the HOA pro bono. Not because I wanted to spend my weekends buried in paperwork, but because I knew taking down Karen in court would be the ultimate victory lap. And honestly, sounded kind of fun. Karen's case hinged on one main argument, that Greg's leadership had caused irreparable harm to the neighborhood. She cited things like Susan's disco porch light, which she called a blight on community aesthetics, Greg's backyard barbecues, which she claimed violated noise ordinances, and, wait for it, the garden gnomes, because of course, her evidence? Mostly photos. Grainy images of Susan's porch light blinking in the distance, blurry shots of Greg's barbecue smoke wafting into the air, and close-ups of garden gnomes that looked more cheerful than menacing. When we got to court, Karen showed up dressed like she was auditioning for Law and Order. She had a binder stuffed with papers and an air of self-importance that could have filled the entire courtroom. "Your Honor," she began with a dramatic flair that made me wonder if she'd practiced in front of a mirror. "This case is about preserving the integrity of our community." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. She spent nearly an hour presenting her evidence. Photos, emails, even excerpts from HOA bylaws that she'd cherry-picked to support her claims. It was like watching someone try to build a house out of toothpicks. Impressive effort, but ultimately doomed to collapse. When it was my turn to respond, I kept it simple. "Your Honor," I said with a smile, "this case isn't about preserving integrity. It's about one person's inability to let go of power." I then proceeded to dismantle Karen's arguments piece by piece. I pointed out that Susan's porch light wasn't violating any codes and honestly looked kind of cool. That Greg's barbecues were well within noise limits, because who complains about burgers? And that garden gnomes weren't even mentioned in the bylaws. Seriously? But here's where things got really fun. I brought up Karen's own history as HOA president. The fines, the unauthorized expenses, the roof repairs, and argued that if anyone had caused harm to the neighborhood, it was her. The courtroom murmured as I presented receipts and documents backing up my claims. Even the judge raised an eyebrow when I mentioned Karen's infamous wine and cheese nights funded by HOA dues. Karen tried to object, something about irrelevant information. But the judge shut her down faster than you can say, overruled. By the time closing arguments rolled around, Karen looked like someone who just realized their coupon had expired at checkout. Her confidence was gone. Her binder sat unopened on the table. Even her dramatic flair had fizzled out. The judge deliberated for all of 10 minutes before delivering his verdict. case dismissed. He even added a warning about filing frivolous lawsuits, a subtle jab at Karen that made me want to high-five him on the spot. As we walked out of the courtroom, Greg turned to me and said, "Jack, you're my hero." I laughed. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to deal with Susan's disco light." Karen? She disappeared after that, not literally but figuratively. She stopped attending meetings, stopped sending emails, stopped taping flyers to mailboxes. It was like she'd finally accepted defeat, or maybe just realized she couldn't win against an entire neighborhood united against her nonsense. Life in our little suburban bubble went back to normal, or as normal as it could be, with Greg as president and Susan hosting impromptu dance parties on her porch every weekend. Ethan got his medication without incident. Greg kept flipping burgers. And yes, Greg's garden gnome stayed right where it belonged, smiling proudly on his lawn. So what's the moral of this story? Simple. Never underestimate the power of community or barbecue. And if you ever find yourself facing off against someone like Karen, remember, facts beat pettiness every time. Thanks for sticking around for this wild ride through suburban drama. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, who doesn't love a good revenge tale? Be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, especially those dealing with our own Karens. Comment below with your thoughts or HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more content just like this. Because hey, life might not always be perfect, but at least we can laugh about it together.